Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 11th, where we are continuing to discuss the sonnets, getting ready to transition into our first play, which happens to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. And you'll remember when we talked about the sonnets, we talked about there are over 150 of them, not that we are going to be reading all of them. They were probably mostly written during times of plague when the theater houses were closed. These are very structured poems that are 14 lines long that do not have titles, so we reference them either by the first line or by its number based on the chronology that scholars have put these poems into. It's a 10-syllable line, what we call iambic pentameter, of stressed and unstressed syllables. There is a rhyme scheme or a rhyme pattern, which is ABAB, CD, EF, GG. Those last two lines rhyming together and serving as a kind of summary for what the sonnet is about. And sonnets should be about serious, important, lofty themes. And that these sonnets have been divided into two groups. The early set of sonnets that were probably written for a young man, likely Shakespeare's patron, and the later set of sonnets that are written to someone known as the Dark Lady, someone who would have dark features. And last class, we focused on three sonnets that were part of the earlier set of sonnets, including the very famous sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? So we know that, at least according to scholars, those sonnets are part of the early set of sonnets that are written to a young man. So today I wanted to talk about the later sonnets that are thought to have been written to a dark lady, a woman with dark hair, dark eyes, not necessarily dark skin, which is something that we'll also see in A Midsummer Night's Dream in the character of Hermia. And once again, I selected just three representative sonnets with three different readers for you to get a sense of how different actors or different readers would go about performing these particular sonnets. And I do recommend that you read these sonnets out loud and you listen to others read them out loud so that you can hear the rhythms. Sir Patrick Stewart, as I had indicated last class, made this a project of his during COVID where he was reading a sonnet a day. So you can hear him read all of the sonnets, and that's available online. But there are certainly other people who are reading other sonnets, and if you are struggling with them, you definitely want to reread them. In fact, even if you aren't struggling with them, you definitely want to reread them because each time you reread, you're able to get new meaning and be able to figure out new detail. Paraphrase them, put them in your own language, which is in some ways almost like summarizing plot in a drama. So that at least is a first step. Identify major themes and issues, and we'll see many of those themes repeated in Shakespearean dramas. And pay close attention to the language. Things like symbolism. Is there something that's representational in there? A metaphor where you are comparing two dissimilar things. Of course, the sounds of the words rhyme when the ending of the words sound the same, or alliteration, the beginnings of the words sound the same. And Sonnet 127, and this is obviously written to the Dark Lady, and the old age black was not counted fair. Now, the reading for this that I was able to find is quite interesting. It's through Shakespeare's Globe, and you'll remember that Shakespeare's Globe Theater, the reconstructed Globe Theater, puts on performances of the plays. But the actor that they found to do this reading is black, and it gives a completely different sense to this particular sonnet, which talks about stereotypes and that the stereotype of beauty at the time is to be fair, not necessarily to be dark. And beauty, true beauty, according to this sonnet, is to be the exact opposite of what societal expectations and stereotypes are. You'll see some punning. Shakespeare is very famous for punning. So when he talks about air, it could be hair, Hair, but also air, Heir. And of course, this is talking about things like lineage and family birthright, which was a common theme in Shakespeare's dramas, and how cosmetics are basically seductive and deceptive. And it's a theme we will see again over and over again. They usurp nature, in effect, and in many ways, they can be seen as illegitimate if we're talking about lineage and family birthright. I can't help but think of Shakespeare's tragedies when I read this sonnet because the tragedies are obviously dark, but there's an incredible beauty to that darkness. And again, I wanted you to listen to a professional reader read it, but I'll read it very quickly to you that in the old age, in other words, in the past, black was not counted fair, or in other words, darkness was not counted as beautiful. Or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. The idea of names and family lineage plays throughout this sonnet. But now, so in contemporary times, is black beauty's successive heir. And there's the punning of H-E-I-R, but also could be hair for dark hair. And beauty slandered with a bastard shame. Again, the idea of family lineage. For since each hand hath put on nature's power, in other words, putting on cosmetics, or perhaps using clothing as a facade, faring the foul, notice the repetition of the F sounds, faring the foul, that's alliteration, with art's false borrowed face. In other words, something like cosmetics don't show natural beauty. Sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profaned, if not lives in disgrace. Therefore my mistress's eyes, and at the time mistress just meant a woman. It didn't necessarily have a sexual connotation, but there's been lots of speculation about this dark lady. At the very least, she was a woman that Shakespeare was infatuated with. At the most, she was a woman that he was having an active affair with. And as we know very little about Shakespearean biography. So there's lots of speculation as to who this woman might be, but there's nothing definitive to indicate who she is. But obviously, the sonnet is written to a woman. And we had talked about some of the earlier sonnets that we read that were general enough to be applicable in lots of different situations. This one less so. And therefore my mistress's eyes are raven black, her brow so suited, and they mourner seem, at such who, not born fair, no beauty lack. Still, this person possesses beauty, even though they aren't fair in terms of their features. Slandering creation with a false esteem, yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so. And this is what really reminds me of the tragedies, the idea of woe and grief and darkness having a kind of beauty associated with them. So that was Sonnet 127. I also assigned Sonnet 130 because in some ways it's the exact opposite of Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, which is filled with hyperbole and exaggeration that this person surpasses the summer's day, as we talked about last class, and that this person will live eternally in memory, in part because of the power of the poet. So I believe I had indicated last class that it's very difficult to draw biographical conclusions about Shakespeare based on these sonnets, even though individuals try to do so, because ultimately the sonnets will sometimes contradict themselves. And this is actually a nice example because this sonnet, Sonnet 130, shows the exact opposite of hyperbole. So not only is it a sonnet of realism that no one can meet the expectations of perfection, but it also is a sonnet that mocks the hyperbole, the extreme exaggeration that oftentimes occurs in poetic structures. And in this particular instance, I have the actor Alan Rickman reading for you to listen to. And this comparison of this woman, and let me get to the exact place here, 130. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. In other words, the sun surpasses the mistress's eyes. Coral is far more red than her lips red. Again, obviously, this is written to a woman, and the reality is that someone's lips can't be redder than coral. If snow be white, well, then her breasts are done. In other words, no one has silky white skin. That's an impossibility. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. And it doesn't seem to be terribly flattering at all, but let's continue on. I've seen roses damask, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. In other words, you can't just say that she has rosy cheeks naturally. That's done through cosmetics. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. At the time, reek wouldn't necessarily have the negative connotation that it does today. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. You know, the idea that someone is so graceful, it's as if they're floating or flying, an impossibility. But those last two lines, which serve as a kind of summary, is really the power of this poem. And yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare, as any she belied with false compare. In other words, that this person is possessing a beauty of reality, not one that is an impossible perfection. And perhaps this is the most realistic and touching of the sonnets when we think about a sonnet trying to flatter and to honor an individual. And now finally, the last sonnet that I wanted to assign is Sonnet 151, which is a highly sexual sonnet. So we had talked about that this was a time where bawdiness was very much embraced. And that said, it was still important for a woman to retain her virginity, which is part of the plot for Midsummer Night's Dream, as we will discuss. However, there's a lot of sexual punning both in A Midsummer Night's Dream and in some of Shakespeare's sonnets. And 151 is a wonderful example of that. And I have the actor Tobias Menzies reading this sonnet. But you will see in this particular sonnet that what we've got is a lot of sexual imagery. And of course, we know that Shakespeare could easily say that he didn't intend it necessarily to be sexual, which would absolve him perhaps of any responsibility or any guilt. But it's hard not to see the sexual imagery when we're told love is too young to know what conscience is. In other words, that young love doesn't understand guilt or conscience. Yet, who knows not conscience is born of love? That after love, this is where we learn things like guilt and getting a conscience. Then, gentle cheater, urge not my amiss. So he's talking about something that's a cheater, and as we read on further, we'll find out that he's talking about his physical body, which is cheating and betraying his intellectual love, which he wants to be pure. But there also is the physical lust that he is unable to control. Less guilty of my faults thy sweet self prove, for thou, betraying me, I do betray my nobler part to my gross body's treason. And he's talking about his penis there. My soul doth tell my body that it may triumph in love. Flesh stays no farther reason. But rising at that name, or I should say, but rising at thy name, in other words, erection, doth point out thee as his triumphant prize. Proud of this pride. Notice all the P words here for proud, pride, and also what's unstated, which is penis. Proud of this pride, he is contented thy poor drudge to be. In other words, he's a slave of his passions to this dark lady. To stand in thy affairs and fall by thy side. And the idea of the rising and falling of erection, and again, affairs could just be business affairs, but they could also be sexual affairs as well. No want of conscience hold it that I call her love, for whose dear love I rise and fall. So this gives you just a little bit of a taste, if you will, of some of Shakespeare's language and also some of his stylistic choices. And this sense of the spirit of pure love as opposed to physical love is something that, again, we will see characters struggle with, including in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is going to be our first full play. It is a comedy. So there are certain characteristics that are associated with comedies. And even though we usually associate comedies with humor, and there are elements of humor in Shakespearean comedies, ultimately what a Shakespearean comedy meant during this time period is that the play would be about love and all of its misunderstandings. However, we would also have no death and a happy ending. And a happy ending would mean basically marriage or the promise of marriage. I'll let you decide whether or not you think it's a happy ending or not. And in some ways, it's very similar to the genre of rom-com, if you're familiar with that genre and contemporary films. Comedies would also have lots of music and dance associated with them. They were very celebratory, and it's thought that the comedies were oftentimes performed immediately before or after a wedding. So, of course, the tone had to be lighthearted. And we will see elements where Shakespeare uses rhyme in the dialogue, and oftentimes to illustrate that these are higher level characters. And oftentimes we'll use verse or just complete sentences in dialogue to oftentimes illustrate that these are lower level characters. But as we had talked about a couple classes back, Shakespeare can mix things up to show somebody going up the chain of being, that philosophy that everything has a ranking in society, with God at the top, and then the angels, and then humans, and so forth. And the king would be basically God's mouthpiece, or the queen, and they would be the closest to basically something that would be considered religious, and the closest one could get to God. However, we will see in something like A Midsummer Night's Dream that kings and queens, whether they're human or they're fairies, because there are fairies in this play, there's a good amount of fantasy that's associated in this play, that ultimately they too have their trials and tribulations when it comes to love, and can act equally ridiculous when it comes to affairs of the heart, so to speak. So, in terms of Shakespeare's plays as a whole, one of the predictive things we can anticipate with the plays is that they have a 5-act structure. It looks like, in some respects, a pyramid. And Act 1, which would be at the bottom left-hand side of the pyramid, would basically be our introduction to characters. And we will see that in Midsummer Night's Dream there are many characters, which is oftentimes the case with comedies. They're more of an ensemble story rather than something like the tragedies, and even the titles will give you an idea that the tragedies focus on a particular person. Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, for instance, as opposed to something like A Midsummer Night's Dream, or something like Much Ado About Nothing, which obviously doesn't necessarily focus on one central character. And because there are so many characters, expect it to be confusing. And there are many reasons why this play is meant to be deliberately confusing. One of the reasons why is because love is confusing. And we will see lots of love relationships of people falling in and out of love. What I recommend is that you try to keep a chart or a list of all the love relationships. One of the messages is in the play is that love is quite fickle, and that relationships can quickly change, and allegiances can quickly change. But you are going to be introduced to basically the main cast of characters in Act 1, and there are multiple subplots that will all come together as the play progresses. So there are multiple stories, but in one way or another, they all relate to love. So if we were to think about that pyramid again, Act 2, and we will find this when we're reading Midsummer Night's Dream, is the beginnings of conflict. So we will, this is the rising of the pyramid, so we will see some of the difficulties that these couples are facing because of love. And what we will see is that regardless of age and regardless of status and regardless of even humanity or supernatural abilities or supernatural elements, that everyone and every creature is subject to the challenges of love. Act 3 in a Shakespearean play would be the height of the pyramid, and this is where we get the height of action. So you can expect that things will come to a head, so to speak, in Act 3. Then we begin to get descent in Act 4, which is the beginning of the lowering of the pyramid or the completion of the pyramid on the right-hand side. So Act 4 is where we get the beginnings of resolution to the conflict that we have been encountering in the play. And in Act 5, we get a resolution. So you can sort of expect that pyramid structure in all of Shakespeare's plays. That said, Midsummer is slightly different because it would seem that the play could end in Act 4. There seems to be enough resolution. And Act 5, without any kind of thought, might seem to be superfluous. Trust me, nothing is superfluous when it comes to Shakespeare. Act 5 is just as important as any of the other acts in the play. So what we need to do when we get to Act 5 is to figure out why Shakespeare would give us that act, which is a play within a play, a very common Shakespearean technique to draw our attention to the fact that we are watching a play, and that technique is known as metadrama, but also to use that play within a play to comment on the action that we've already seen. And also, oftentimes, to comment on just the theater as a whole and actors as a whole. We'll see all of that in Midsummer Night's Dream. So expect it to be confusing because we've got lots of names, and some of the names sound very similar. Helena and Hermia, they both start with an H. It's easy to get them mixed up. We're supposed to get them mixed up. Again, part of the theme is that love is very fickle. It's almost like a soap opera where we've got changes of relationships over the course of the particular drama. Other characters might have different names, like Lysander and Demetrius, but their personalities seem almost interchangeable. And of course, what we're going to see is the human world and various social classes in the human world all struggling with love. We're going to see the royal world also struggling with love. And we're going to see the fairy world also struggling with love. And again, we will see the interconnectedness of all of these as the play progresses. There will be humor, but remember, Shakespeare's plays are meant to be performed, not read. And a performance is never a substitute for reading, but reading is never a substitute for a performance. You really need to do both, which is why we are going to be watching a performance for class as well as reading. So I'm hopeful that while we've been talking about the sonnets, that you've been reading A Midsummer Night's Dream. What would be ideal, and I understand the world isn't always ideal, but what would be ideal is that when we next meet again for Monday's class, and actually, if I'm remembering correctly, I think Monday's a holiday. I need to look into this, but we may not be meeting on Monday. We might be meeting on the Wednesday after that. But I'm pretty sure that we've got a holiday coming up. Unfortunately, I don't have my syllabus in front of me, so I can't verify it. But I'll make sure to put it in our notes on our Moodle page. But nevertheless, when we next meet, I would hope that you have Midsummer Night's Dream finished in its entirety so that when we talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream for the next couple classes, you're moving on to the next play and reading that at home, which happens to be Much Ado About Nothing, another comedy, similar kind of themes, but Much Ado About Nothing, I can tell you, is definitely centered in the world of reality. So if you don't necessarily like the fantasy world, you'll get the world of reality in the next play, and vice versa. So it's one of the reasons why I selected these two plays. And expect lots of social and political commentary, but it won't be obvious. It'll be subtle, and it'll be implied. And the reason why is because talking about politics could really get you into trouble during this time period. There will be lots of sexual references as well, and they probably are more obvious than some of the social and political commentary, but usually not discussed when A Midsummer Night's Dream is studied at the junior high school or high school level. It's a very popular play to read at that level because it's a happy play with a happy ending where no one dies, and love is one of those universal emotions. But more often than not, the sexual aspects aren't discussed just because of the challenges of doing that with the younger audience. But we will talk about this, and I can guarantee you that Shakespeare's audience, because remember, Shakespeare was writing for his time period, not for us, his audience would have been well aware of the sexual connotations that existed within the play. So, our next class, we will talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. We will talk about performance as well. We will also talk about papers, because now we're getting to the point where we're starting the plays. And my thinking is that your first paper would address either the comedies, Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing, and your second paper would address either the history play, which for us is going to be Richard II, or the tragedies, which would be either Macbeth or Othello. But more on that later because, as you know, our first paper isn't due until midway in the semester. But I still wanted to, now that we've moved away from the sonnets and we're starting to talk about the dramas, I wanted to talk a little bit more about papers so that you can begin to contemplate some ideas and possibilities for how to proceed. So I see the sonnets as a way to sort of introduce us to Shakespearean language and themes as we get ready to actually address some of the plays. And for today's attendance question, which would be due Friday the 13th, how interesting. Of the sonnets we've read for this class, so we've talked about the 3 sonnets for this class, 127, 130, 151. Which one is your favorite and why? And I had asked a similar question last class, but that was of the earlier set of sonnets. Obviously, there are no right or wrong answers here. I'm more interested in your reasoning and your thinking, and you are certainly encouraged to respond to your peers, but you're not required to respond to your peers. You are required, however, to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That would give you a good idea of some of the things that we would be talking about over the course of the semester if we were meeting in a face-to-face class. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class by talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. Take care. Bye-bye.